Thank you very much, Debbie. It's a great pleasure to be invited here to share this talk with you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a 53-year-old married father of 3 young children. I run a small holding just the other side of Nebworth from here. And I'm in my second career. I spent 25 years flying airplanes for a living. And something happened to me about 10 years ago. I'd just become a father. And I was sort of introspecting about the role of fatherhood, if you like. And it occurred to me that I was about to sort of show my son how to live his life, you know, across the sort of broad spectrum. And at the same time, I was having my mercury amalgam fillings removed. And the dentist who was doing that had this protocol where he put me on an intense program of nutrition. And these two thoughts collided in my head, and I realized that I didn't know how to nourish myself. I realized that I had no idea what foods supported my health and which foods compromised it. And the idea that I was about to raise a child just suddenly catalyzed me into going on a quest, if you like, to try and find out how to be healthy. So it wasn't so much a journey of trying to recover from disease. You hear a lot of people who are talking about health issues that have actually cured themselves from something. So I'm not one of those. I've sort of come in from the preventative side of it, if you like. So that's kind of how I got into all of this. So that's me and my wife, Linny. So I'm going to be sharing with you a perspective this evening, which I hope you might find useful. I'm not a doctor, I'm not medically trained, I have no formal training in health. But what I do offer is the benefit of my own experience, my own sort of unquenchable desire to sort of find out how to achieve health. And there's, as we all know, there's so much information out there today. There's somebody says this and somebody else says the opposite, and there's so much contradictory information about diet and the whole health thing, really. So I endeavoured to sort of tackle this and try and come out the other side with some sense of how do I achieve my own health. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. And as I said, hopefully you'll find this perspective interesting and even helpful. So I'm also going to share with you the sort of thinking framework and a sort of a snapshot, if you like, of my methodology in terms of trying to find out what's true and what's not. So again, for whatever value you may gain from it, and I hope you gain some. So I consider myself a holistic health advocate or a health coach, you could say. But more fundamentally than that, I consider myself a thinker, and I found that this is very much necessary in order to sift through all this sort of maze of information, if you like. And even more fundamentally than that, I found that I needed to be a philosopher, because it's when we start the process of thinking and inquiry and trying to be confident that we've found truth, we have to resort to some basic philosophical convictions. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Obviously, that's not the main thrust of the evening. So let's kick off with just reminding ourselves what the goal is. It might sound obvious, but the goal is to have the best life possible. We all want to have the most wonderful life, the happiest life, really. That's what it comes down to. And an obvious prerequisite of that is having a fully functioning vehicle. So it's going to operate well, do everything you want, an operating mind and everything well into our old age. That's really what we're trying to achieve. So let's step back and just examine the context in which we are seeking to uncover the sort of the ways we can change the way we live in order to best avail ourselves to this outcome of optimal health. Longevity, I don't know about you guys, but I want to break 100. I want to make 110 if I can. So the goal is to get there with this full functional capability of our mind as well as our body. But at the moment, everyone's aware that we have an epidemic of disease. It's difficult to find a healthy person, to be quite honest. I'm sure all of us know various people suffering from one ailment or another. And we have epidemic proportions of all of the chronic diseases, and across the age spectrum, you know, from autism and ADHD through depression and anxiety, you know, right up to the other end, and Alzheimer's disease, of course, heart disease, cancer, stroke, you know, all of these things, all in epidemic proportions. So we've got a health crisis going on. That's the context in which we're asking ourselves, how can we best predispose ourselves to be healthy? How can we stack as many cards, if you like, in the right direction? You can't get them all stacked in the right direction. That would be virtually impossible, but as long as we focus on getting as much pointing in the right direction as possible. So another aspect of the context is that health is under attack like it never has been before. So almost every age, if you like, will have its own unique challenges, and every period in history is unique. But where we are at today, we've got these unique set of factors coming together that are challenging human health. Wrong diet, just zip through these, it's just to sort of illustrate the picture. Wrong diet is probably a massive one. We've got glyphosate, an antibiotic in the environment everywhere. We'll talk about that in a bit. Man-made chemical toxins. We've got dreadful quality tap water. We've got mercury in our teeth and fillings, toxic vaccines. We've got a 24/7 culture of people sort of shift working and double jobs and blue screen TVs into the night and all that sort of thing. We've got electromagnetic field saturation. We all use mobiles, Wi-Fi, and that's another thing that we're going to touch briefly on. And then, of course, we've got sedentary lifestyles. We've got office jobs, sitting at desks all day, and couch potato lifestyle. We've got all of these threats. So within the context, there is some good news as well. There's a lot of research has been done. We've come to a point where we're very fortunate that it's entirely possible to know how to be healthy these days. And that might sound like a bold statement to make, but hopefully at the end of this, you'll be somewhat convinced. So, you know, as we progress through recent human history, we've discovered sanitation. We no longer, you know, we know that we mustn't be drinking puddle water, for example. You know, we've ditched cholera and typhoid and these sorts of diseases. We've come into, you know, Joseph Lister, namesake of our local hospital here, the surgeon who discovered if he washed his hands, his patients were more likely to recover from their operations. So we discovered the need for sanitation and keep things clean. And that extended into germ theory. But now we've moved even beyond that. Germ theory obviously holding that microbes and all these tiny little things are the enemy and you've got to kill them all dead. And now, of course, we understand that isn't actually true. We've also got the relatively new science of epigenetics. And epigenetics tells us how the microbes in the environment and the environment in general helps or contributes, I should say, to switching the human genes on or off, the sort of genetic signaling, if you like. So the environment determines what or how our genes express. And of course, environment, you must think of the blood as well. The blood is your internal environment. So the nature of your blood and its composition obviously affects, well, not obviously, but it does affect your genetic expression. So we've come to the point where we acknowledge that microbes, bacteria, are indeed our friends. I'm sure you all know how popular gut health is now in the media and so forth. You know, most people are aware that gut health is important, and this is a good thing. Although the mainstream medical fraternity, whilst they accept to some degree that this is happening and the advent of probiotics is indicative of that, we still have a situation where, you know, antibiotics are horrendously overused. So hopefully that will come to an end shortly. So the context still. So we have this information and disinformation with the internet. We have the whole thing mixed together and this challenge of working out what's true and what isn't. And this is exacerbated, if you like, by the mainstream medical fraternity who, you know, I mean, to say they're dragging their heels would be putting it kindly. Pharmaceutical corporations, we know that they educate doctors, and there seems to be a huge inertia to overcome to getting them to sort of grasp some of the new ideas that are coming out and the new discoveries that have been made. So another important part of our context then is that you can't necessarily go to your doctor to find out how to be healthy. Our doctors are still convinced that everything is genetic. Back in the 1950s, it was big news. It's all in your genes. You know, soon you'll be able to spit in a cup, and we'll be able to tell you exactly what diseases you're going to have, and sort out all the cures for them, and it'll all be easy. But of course, you know, the Human Genome Project shattered that illusion. So we've now discovered that it's not all in the genes, but unfortunately the medical fraternity still do hold on to that one. The official view of cancer is that it's a genetic disease, the most prevalent genetic disease. And there's good information, in fact, that shows that it's a metabolic disease. So your doctor... You can't have an epidemic, by the way, of a genetic disease. I'm sure you know, you'll be able to see, because if something's genetic, if a certain percentage of the population carry the gene for whatever it is, then you're not going to see an exponential rise in the cases of that particular disease. It can't happen without external factors, and of course those external factors are environmental. So the doctor also treats symptoms with drugs. And this is not addressing root causes. So, you know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you're not addressing the cause of an issue, you're not really going to prevent it. And, you know, we could go on. You're not going to get much knowledge about nutrition from doctors. They ignore the side effects. And, of course, they're prescribing antibiotics. So how to be healthy is not something that we're going to find out from our doctor. And also, it's too risky for us to simply look sideways and sort of see what our friends and neighbours are doing, you know, how to see what everybody's eating, what their habits of their life are. We can't do that because there are a lot of people, too many people, who are disinclined to think outside the box, shall we say, and they will be listening to the doctor. They will be listening to the latest news headlines, which unfortunately don't keep pace with the new discoveries that are happening. So it's too risky, really, to just follow others. So as a result of all this, there is, if you like, an evolutionary imperative to become more conscious, to find out stuff, to switch ourselves on and decide that we want to know, and, if you like, seek that personal understanding of how to achieve health. And what I hope to share with you tonight is that this is entirely achievable. Excuse me while I wet my whistle. Also, forgive me if I talk rather fast, but we've got quite a bit to go through. So, thinking and reason are our main tools for this journey of discovery, sifting out the truth from the untruth, working out what's actually happening, what's real and what's not. And underneath that, we need to be mindful of some basic philosophical sort of foundational convictions. And just very briefly, you know, objective knowable reality. If we consider reality as an objective absolute, we know that cause and effect. If we initiate a certain cause, we can expect this effect. And with something like health, which is an effect, we have to work on establishing the causes and putting into place the causes. And if we hold the conviction that our reason is our only guide to knowledge, of course, we'll be very much into looking at the empirical evidence, what works, scientific method, and you can actually arrive at truth. If two people have opposite opinions, if somebody says that saturated fat's bad for you and somebody else says no, saturated fat's really good for you, it's essential, then obviously they can't both be right. One of them is wrong. And that obviously necessitates diving in and having a deeper look at the issue, which is always the case. And then you find that the picture is a little bit more complicated than is often presented. But truth can be found. This is the point. And, of course, free will, which ties in with responsibility. And this means that really, to be healthy these days, to achieve that long, happy life in a body that's working, way into your old age, that does require that we take responsibility for our own health in this context. It maybe wasn't the case 2 generations ago, 100 generations ago, but it very much is these days. So before we can talk about health and the foundations of health and what to do about it, we really need to know what we're talking about, make sure we're all on the same page, if you like. So what exactly is health? I define health as a stable state of maintaining full functionality of mind and body. People's definitions may vary. The World Health Organization did have a definition until recently, which was complete well-being. Health was defined as complete well-being. And now I saw an article in the British Medical Journal just recently saying that they're now going to revise that. They're going to revise it down, water it down to some wishy-washy, sort of coping and adapting with various changes and a load of waffle. But a tragic sort of capitulation, I think. So health really is maintaining this full functionality of our mind and body. And it's also important to remember that health is a consequence. It's not something you can shoot straight for. It's something that results as an effect of various causes. So that is very important in understanding the process of ensuring that we end up with this long, healthy life. And the last point about what is health is that our current state of health is determined by the sum of all our lifestyle choices that we've made before we came into this room. So it's everything that you ate or you didn't eat, all the exercise you did or you didn't do, etc., etc. So it's a cumulative thing with health, and this is why it can take some time to sort of turn the supertanker around, if you like. If you're heading in this direction, a supertanker takes about 10 miles to turn 180 degrees. So that's useful to bear in mind, in that we can't expect overnight instant results. So what are the foundations of health? We've established what health is. I suggest to you that, and I've arrived at my own conclusion, if you like, which I share with you, is that it's the ability to repair and rejuvenate at a cellular level, which is really, right at the fundamentals of it. And there are 3 components, if you like, to the foundations of health. This ability to fend off disease and to repair and keep regrowing our body on an ongoing way. And that's a strong immune system, a healthy mitochondria, and a healthy gut. So we're just going to take a brief walk through the immune system and 1 or 2 things. And I'm sharing this, and we're going to skim through it necessarily, but it's in order that we all really sort of understand why these lifestyle choices that we're going to talk about in a minute are what they are. It's sort of laying the foundation. So do bear with me if I'm, if you know all this, and I don't want to, bore you with stuff that you already know. So the immune system, most of it lies behind the gut wall in something called the gastrointestinal associated lymphatic tissue. So this is basically, it's wrapped around your small intestine in a nutshell. Almost all of your antibodies are made in this part of the immune system. There are other organs in other parts of the body, of course, but that's where the bulk of it is. And the immune system, to function, relies on cell-to-cell communication. It's absolutely vital that the immune system be selective, so cells that are healthy need to be left alone. Cells that need to be repaired, or they need some help with something, need to be able to signal that, and that needs to be communicated. And then when you get a really sick cell, it needs to know that it's time to die, and they commit cell suicide, which is a process called apoptosis, which is quite normal. It's happening all the time in our bodies. So the main method of communication of the immune system is something called redox signaling. So we'll come into that in a minute. So let's look at the inflammatory response. We have acute inflammation and we have chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation is absolutely necessary. It's when we any kind of injury, even when you run down the stairs or go jogging, the tiny compressions of our bones, all of these things cause tiny, tiny little injuries which are always being rebuilt. And acute inflammation is necessary for that. It's obviously necessary for injury and for infection and to repel infectious invaders, pathogens and so forth. So in this process, very, very basically, white blood cells emit a burst of positive charge, and this is sort of mopped up later, if you like, by antioxidants. So you've got, the takeaway point here is that you've got charge, you've got the passage of electrons being transferred, which is really at the root of how the immune system works and how this cell-to-cell communication happens. So chronic inflammation is not at all desirable. Chronic inflammation is widely regarded by mainstream doctors even as the root cause, if you like, of all chronic diseases. This is not really in dispute. And this is caused by acute inflammatory responses simply being consistent and ongoing, and they're becoming a build-up of this positive charge associated with the inflammatory response. This, of course, overwhelms the antioxidant system, and it results in a loss of communication because it's harder to pass charge. You can imagine, without sort of going into electricity and electrical currents and so forth. If you've got a build-up of positive charge, you've sort of skew-whiffed the system, and it impairs the ability of electrons to flow. So this is why chronic inflammation you end up in a situation where your immune system, its ability to communicate, is compromised. So very briefly, we're going to look at these things called redox molecules. Redox signaling is the method by which these cells communicate, or the immune system communicates with cells. So redox comes from a combination of the terms reduction and oxidation. As you may know, reduction is the donating of a spare electron, and oxidation is the removal of a spare electron and the resultant positive charge. So these redox molecules function as the communication system by literally passing electrons along, passing charge, essentially. And you could say that they're like the vocabulary of the cell-to-cell communication. So that means the more of them you have, and the more different kinds of them, the greater fluency and the greater the ability of the immune system to communicate effectively throughout the body. So here's a little picture of a redox molecule. This is one, or the kind of redox molecule made by bacteria. And the interesting thing to note, of course, we know that our gut, our intestines are full of bacteria and microbes and fungi and protozoa and viruses and all this sort of thing. So this is a molecule made by bacteria, and each species creates its own little subset. So it's reckoned about 10 or 15 or so, something in that order. And this helps contribute to that greater fluency. These are very, very useful to the immune system because all of these spare hydrogen ions and oxygen ions can come and go very easily off this molecule. So they're very, very useful for electron charge transfer, if you like. So let's have a brief look at mitochondria. We mentioned that the three fundamentals of health are a healthy gut, healthy mitochondria, and a healthy immune system. So what are mitochondria? They're the tiny organelles within almost every cell of our body, and they're actually not human. They have their own DNA. They have 37 genes. There are about 200 to 3,000 of them within our bodily cells. Red blood cells are exception, they don't have any. Heart, muscle, and brain tissue have up to 3,000, and the number varies. So they're generally also associated. They're associated with, they correlate, I should say, their numbers correlate with longevity, and the numbers tend to decline by about 1% a year. So what is it that mitochondria do? In order to understand why they're so important, let's have a look at what they do. So they provide human cells with energy. So the energy our bodies run on isn't meat and potatoes and vegetables. It isn't even glycogen and the ketones, which is what our food breaks down to, essentially. Our bodies, at the cellular level, run on adenosine triphosphate, something called ATP, which we don't really need to know about, but that is the energy currency of our bodies, and it's made by the mitochondria within the body cells. So this is a really, really important. About 90% of your bodily energy comes from this ATP. And the interesting thing about mitochondria is they can metabolize two kinds of fuel. And this is a really, really important point when we start to talk about lifestyle choices. Your mitochondria can metabolize glucose in the form of glycogen in the blood, And they can also metabolize ketone bodies, which are the breakdown products of dietary fats. And it's worth noting that when they burn glucose, that's a very much a dirty burn. It's like, you know, when you're following some chuntry old bus that's chuffing out black smoke out the back. That's your mitochondria metabolizing sugar, whereas when they're metabolizing ketone bodies, it's more like following a modern car with a catalytic converter. It can't, you know, you might be able to smell the catalytic converter, but there's no fumes coming out. So it's a much, much cleaner fuel, and that's worth bearing in mind. Our mitochondria also make the redox signaling molecules for our body, as do all the microorganisms within our gut. And the mitochondria are very much involved with this cell-cell signaling, telling cells when they need to self-destruct in apoptosis, you know, leaving healthy cells alone and repairing and so forth. Cell division, cell growth, all of these things are regulated effectively using the mitochondria. So they're very, very important. We need to look after them, and that's why we're going to try and look at some lifestyle choices that cater to the needs of our mitochondria, if you like. What is the gut? Not quite such a mystery. The gut, obviously, it's the tube that runs from our mouth and sinuses through the body and out through the anus, and it's essentially the outside world inside us, if you like. Starting with the cavity, the sinus cavities, the mouth, the throat, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, colon, and then back out into the outside world. But depending on who you listen to, surface area, about 2 tennis courts. It's enormous. And this is achieved mainly in the small intestine by the fact that there are all these tiny little carpet-like hairs all protruding from the outside wall into the inside, and that gives the huge surface area. The most important part of the gut is arguably the epithelial layer, the membrane, which serves as the barrier between the outside world as it passes through and your immune system. This is 1 cell thick. It's a tiny, really delicate, intelligent membrane. It's thinner than, I think, half the thickness of a human hair. It's you know, this 1 cell thick membrane. It's very, very vulnerable. And it's an intelligent membrane. It's bound together by these things called tight junctions, these proteins which can open up and close selectively to let things in, block other things from coming in, to let things out, and so forth. So it's very important to notice that the large intestine and the small intestine really comprise something of an ecosystem. There are huge numbers of microbes in a healthy gut. More so in the large intestine, slightly less in the small intestine. But of course, we must remember that our bodies are covered with bacteria all over us, inside us. Every organ has got its own flora, if you like, of bacteria, fungi, viruses, all of these little things. They're everywhere. So what does the gut do? You know, most of us know that it's to do with absorbing nutrition through digestion, and as we mentioned there, secreting toxins. We've probably all heard that it's the second brain via the vagus nerve joining the brain to the gut. The gut microbes are extremely important in that they assist us with actually manufacturing quite a few vitamins. Vitamin C, vitamin K2, even vitamin B12 and some other of the B group are actually made by the enzymatic activity of microbes in your gut. The same goes for hormones and so forth. I think about 90% of your serotonin is made in the human gut. And serotonin being a component of happiness and feel-good factor along with dopamine. And you can see the connection between the gut and the brain is intimate. The other thing we're going to look at that gut microbes do, which is important to remember, is that they actually send out microRNA. These are strands of their genetic material, if you like, that actually serve as signaling medium, not only for us, but also for other microbes within the environment. And it's quite amazing that the RNA, even from other people in a room, even when you cough and you sneeze and you're sharing a living space with someone, we all exchange microRNA all the time, I'm afraid, as gross as that might sound to some of you. So it's really quite amazing. So also, the most important thing that the gut does is it's the front line of the immune system. It's that one cell thick membrane is really, that's where the outside world meets your immune system, through that tiny membrane. It's very, very important. The gut microbes and all of the fungi and all these other tiny single-celled organisms actually assist in maintaining the integrity of the gut lining. So they do this because they also make redox molecules, as we saw earlier, in the enzymatic activity and in the action of breaking down our food. They create these redox molecules, which serve as this massive communication network, which hugely facilitates the gut's ability to keep this epithelial membrane tightly zipped shut, and obviously opening up only when necessary or when required to absorb or secrete as appropriate. So, the incredible thing about the gut, and you've probably all heard about gut dysbiosis, which is a sort of imbalance of the species within the gut due to a number of environmental reasons, as we shall see. But the amazing thing about all these microbes is that it's a bit like a game of paper, scissors, stone. I don't know whether you remember that from childhood days, but it's a game that children play, my children play it now actually, where no one component of the game can ever dominate. Okay? The stone can be wrapped by the paper can be cut by the scissors, and the scissors can be smashed by the stone. And this essentially is a useful metaphor for what's going on inside your gut. The more bacteria we have, and the more protozoa, and the more fungi and viruses and all these things, they all serve to regulate each other. They breed each other, they eat each other, they control each other, and it's like a massive, forest. It's like a whole ecosystem, like a coral reef, if you like, in its complexity. And it's largely the diversity of species along with the actual numbers of microbes that helps keep the balance. And various insults such as diet, eating too much sugar, of course, favours and promotes one narrow sort of band of species to the loss of all the others. So some pathogenic kinds of bacteria get fed favourably by our dietary sugar, and of course they get an artificial leg up, and you get a dysbiosis of the gut. You get an imbalance. Also, of course, with antibiotics, as we shall see, you take a course of antibiotics, it wipes out only the bacteria, it doesn't touch the fungi and the viruses, but it does give the fungi and the viruses an opportunity to move into the space. So you can see how all of these things and these aspects of our lifestyle have a huge impact on that ecosystem, which is the gut, and that's precisely what we don't want. We want a broad diversity. So what exactly is a healthy gut? A healthy gut basically comprises of that healthy epithelial layer, not leaking, so no leaky gut. As we mentioned, a broad diversity of microbes in sufficient numbers, and also a healthy immune system behind the gut lining, which is, of course, greatly facilitated by the fact that there are no leaks in the membrane. So let's take a quick look at glyphosate. Might try and speed up a little bit here because I need to get all of this in. So forgive me if I'm gabbling a little bit. Glyphosate, I'm sure you've all heard of it. It was first created by somebody in Japan, and the patent was quickly bought up by Monsanto. It was originally discovered to be a chelator, something that grabs hold of minerals and doesn't let go. It was then patented as a herbicide and then subsequently an antibiotic. It is a very powerful and very deadly antibiotic. It kills single-celled organisms on contact, and it kills plants by blocking certain metabolic pathways which prevent the plants from manufacturing certain amino acids. So it notably it prevents them from producing tyrosine, phenylalanine, and tryptophan. Phenylalanine and tryptophan are two of the essential amino acids required by the human body that we can't make. So you won't be getting them in your diet either if your food has had glyphosate sprayed on it, which is... yes, there's a couple here. Sorry. Yeah, no problem. Would you like one that Debbie hand there you go. So yeah, it was glyphosate became marketed as Roundup from 1976. It's sprayed on everyone's lawns, hugely taken up by agriculture. It's even admitted to be a mitochondrial toxin and endocrine disruptor by the World Health Organization. In 1992, it began being used by farmers as a desiccant, which means they were spraying it on their wheat just prior to harvest, 3 days before you want to roll the combines out. You spray with glyphosate, it kills the crop, dries it out beautifully and prepares it for harvest. But then, of course, that harvest of wheat is drenched in glyphosate and destined to end up in your loaf of bread. Glyphosate, unfortunately, is almost everywhere in the environment because it's a water-soluble toxin. Unlike most other toxins which are lipid-soluble, they can be sequestered in body fat and so forth, and they can be rendered, they can be locked up, if you like, and not do any damage. Because glyphosate is water-soluble, it's literally in the air. It's in the water, it's in the rain. So when we see, the farmers spraying fields with glyphosate, and it's literally everywhere. It's going into the water, which is a tragedy. It's massively used, and we'll skip through this, but the takeaway point here is that it kills bacteria in the gut. So there's glyphosate in your food. It's in all food. It's even in organic food, only a bit less in organic food, hopefully considerably less, but it kills bacteria in our gut. And it also destroys the gut lining. It breaks apart these tight junctions that knit the epithelial layer together and results in leaky gut. So what is leaky gut? It's basically the breakdown of this integrity of the epithelial layer. And we'll zip through this because we are getting short of time. It's caused by glyphosate. It's also caused by gluten and its breakdown product gliadin, which is in various grains. There's a synergistic effect when wheat is sprayed with glyphosate and the two come together. It's even worse. It's sort of 1 and 1 makes 3 situation. There are other toxins that cause leaky gut as well, even alcohol and mercury from fillings, as I think we mentioned earlier on. So leaky gut is really something that you don't want. The implications of leaky gut is essentially that things get through into your immune system, into your body that shouldn't get through. So everything from undigested pieces of food, of potato, of fish, or whatever you've eaten, chunks, can get through into the immune system. And what's that going to do? That's going to cause an immune response. So obviously also all the pathogens, the viruses, the microbes, anything can get through a leaky gut. And when you've got serious leaky gut, that membrane that should be 100% intact and it should be selectively opening and closing just becomes a sieve. And this is absolute disaster for the body. Zonulin is a substance made by the gut lining and actually is involved in selectively opening and closing the tight junctions to allow things in and out. When you have leaky gut, and particularly caused by glyphosate, this zonulin is overproduced and it goes systemic. It goes through the holes that it's created, and it goes systemic through the body and affects the blood-brain barrier, the kidney tubules, and everything can leak. Even hydration being impaired because the colon no longer works. That's where your body tends to reabsorb water from the stool, and that process breaks down as well because obviously the integrity of the membrane is compromised. So perhaps we're beginning to see why health begins in the gut. Health is maintained, as we observe, by the immune system's ability to repair and rejuvenate in this ongoing way at the cellular level. And the process is enabled by cell-to-cell communication using redox molecules. And the microbes in the gut help keep the epithelial membrane intact and sealed, and by driving this ongoing process of repair and rejuvenation of the gut lining. So absolutely crucial. The microbes, the more of those we have, the larger our microbiome, if you like. Although we should say that microbiota is the term for the number of microbes. Microbiome refers to their genetic material, the sum of their genetic material. But it's the diversity of these microbes. If you've got them in sufficient numbers, and we're talking tens of thousands, 30, 40, 50,000 species of bacteria, hundreds of thousands of species of fungi, and even millions of species of viruses. So all of this comes together to enable us to withstand a lot of the toxic insults that are in our environment today. Even when you don't sleep right, you know, if you're exposed to electromagnetic fields from your mobile phone, from various poisons and toxins you might ingest, it can all be coped with to some extent by a healthy immune system. And the gut lining can be repaired in an ongoing way. Until, of course, you get too much glyphosate coming down the chute in your diet, which is turning the gut lining into a sieve. So there are obviously a few additional principles of health, as I'm sure you're all aware. Adequate nutrition being an obvious one. Our bodies need to get the right stuff to build the structure. We need to be able to detoxify. We need to be able to manage our stress. This is a key aspect in the onset of many diseases and things like heart attacks. Exercise is obviously a big one. And lastly, periodic fasting. So I mention these because these factors are also taken into consideration with these lifestyle choices that we're going to look at in just a moment. Periodic fasting is really highly recommended. It's a fantastically powerful tool to not only maintain health, but also to get back into a state of health when you're ill. You may notice some animals and pets don't eat when they get sick. When we fast, our body kicks into something called autophagy, which you may have heard of, which is essentially, it literally translates to self-eating. And it's the body doing a sort of clearing out the rubbish sort of thing, doing a spring clean. Any cells that are remotely compromised are immediately dismantled, destroyed, and the amino acids are recycled into new cells. So fasting is a very, very highly recommended practice to consider looking into and maybe factoring into your life. So, how are we doing for time? A little bit pushed for time. Right, lifestyle choice number one is, given the context we're in, given this soup of disinformation and information, it really behoves us to become thinkers, to reappraise our values consciously. And by that I mean really consciously evaluating what is important to us. Is that donut we have every morning at 11 o'clock that important compared to our long-term health? Yes, we like pizza and we like spaghetti bolognese, or we might like cheesecake, whatever it is. These things, we have to visit this consciously and decide, well, if the consequences of that equal undermining my health, is it really such a value for me? So this is what I mean by becoming a thinker and developing a habit of really seeking to understand what it is that's going to promote our health and what it is that's going to compromise it. And if we can keep those things in mind, it very much helps us make these daily lifestyle choices, when we meet them on a day-to-day basis. So, also, the last point there is that your mind is the manager of your life. It's your mind that's going to say yes or no to that current bun or that chocolate bar or that can of Coke or whatever it is. So if we're a thinker, if we're active, that's going to predispose us in the best way to making the right decisions in the light of, and also gaining knowledge, of course. So very, very briefly, this is the framework which I'm going to show you, which is remember the goal, be cognizant of the goal and the full context of what it is that we're trying to evaluate. Make sure that we've defined terms. Whenever we're talking with other people, it's very important to know that we're on the same page. it's very important to acknowledge a standard of value. And one of the things I love about health is, of course, that the standard of value of being pro-human life is already baked into the conversation. So all of us here are on a sort of a pro-life premise already when we're talking about health. But in other subjects, that's not usually as obvious. It's really important to think in principles and to think fundamentals to really try and get to the root causes if we want to try and enjoy the benefits of these outcomes, of these effects that amount to health. Of course, we have to respect cause and effects, which is what I just said. And we can remember, of course, that contradictions don't exist. So contradictory information signifies that there's something wrong there and more investigation is required. So asking questions and sub-questions. And lastly, of course, evaluating all pros and cons honestly and accurately. And this is something that never happens in the mainstream. This is why I'm, you know, an outside-the-box kind of person. I discovered through my own journey that I couldn't answer my questions, or I couldn't get my questions answered by the mainstream because, for example, the vaccine debate. Now, whatever you may think about vaccines or not, the pros of having your children vaccinated or having a flu jab are always trumpeted sky high. You'll all be familiar with that. The drawbacks, the negatives, the dangers of not vaccinating are always hammed up and blown sky high. Now, you won't hear anybody talk about the dangers of taking of these vaccines, and they won't be honestly represented. And you won't hear anybody talking about the benefits of not vaccinating your children. So this is just an example of how it's really important to evaluate all of the issues honestly, objectively, and accurately. So, enough of that. Lifestyle choice number 2 is this massive one of diet. And it's most definitely your most powerful tool in the box. It's the most influential, it's the biggest influence you can bring to bear on your genetic expression, if you will. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, said it about 2,500 years ago. Let thy food be thy medicine. You've probably all heard that one before. So what it really comes down to is that in this conscious valuation of our values, of deciding what's important, we have to bring this to our dietary choices and evaluate eating for health and taste versus just eating for taste. So this is something that needs to be borne in mind as we make various dietary changes. Try to focus not exclusively on taste. Also, as I mentioned there briefly, food is like a genetic download. All of the microRNA in food, whether it be meat or plants, all serves potentially to trigger our own genetic expression. So a key point about lifestyle choices, as we're trying to stack all these cards in our favour for health, we must re-evaluate and question the whole convenience lifestyle. I mean, it sounds obvious, and I'm sure you're all aware of this already, but sort of grabbing these snacks on the go, yes, we can all understand why it happens, and sometimes you can't avoid it, etc., etc. But the grim reality is that we have to spend more time in the kitchen. We've got to buy real ingredients, we've got to carefully source them, and we've got to make food in the kitchen. This is unavoidable. The avoidance of sugar, sweets and cakes is essential because of the way that it disrupts the species profile of our microbes within the gut. As I mentioned earlier there, it favours the pathogenic bacteria. To some extent, these days, it's reckoned that there's almost no such thing as pathogenic bacteria because, as we've already discussed, if you have a broad enough diversity, you will get the stability. It's possible for somebody with a healthy gut to eat an egg with salmonella or E. coli or something and not develop any illness at all. That's entirely possible, and you might be sitting next to somebody in the same restaurant that eats the same thing who will be horrendously ill. And that will depend almost entirely on the health of your gut and the diversity specifically of your microbes in the gut. So for similar reasons and others, we need to steer away from consuming processed food. And this is really difficult because, you know, we all know that our culture is almost wrapped around unhealthy food. You know, if you just walk into a W.H. Smith's or a, you know, a co-op store, which I've got local to me in Nebworth, and there's so much temptation. It's incredible. There's virtually no healthy food in my local co-op at all. There's nothing organic. There's plenty of sweets and cakes and additives and processed stuff. So it's very, very difficult. But we must be conscious of this, and we must remember to factor it into our lifestyle as much as we can, if we want to live till 80, 90, 100 and maintain functionality of our body. This is the price we have to pay. Processed foods obviously contain all the nasty additives. Inflammatory oils, omega-6 oils, as you probably know, are the inflammatory oils versus the omega-3s, which tend to be anti-inflammatory. All processed food is made with inflammatory omega-6 oils. And you know, you could extend that into not using things like safflower oil, canola oil, you know, rapeseed oil. I think that's what they call canola. All of these kind of vegetable oils, yes, fashionable in some degree, but they're all inflammatory. They're all inflammatory, and they really shouldn't be. They shouldn't be in your diet at all. And for goodness' sake, don't cook with any of them, because they easily break down into a sort of a bastardized version of themselves, and those particles of fat molecules end up getting used in cell walls. You end up wearing the distorted fat molecules, literally. So it's very important to bear this in mind. For reasons that we touched on earlier, it's important to minimize, if not avoid, I would recommend avoiding wheat and various grains. Essentially, they're sugar. You know, there's some debate that whole grains have some healthy aspects, and, you know, that's something to look into. I would say, from my experience, that the negatives far outweigh any potential positives there. Any health benefits from whole grains can be achieved elsewhere without the toxic load of the glyphosate and without the synergistic effect of the gluten and gliadin and the glyphosate ripping your gut lining apart, which is something you really don't want. So also, wheat and grains, I should mention, are obviously sugar. By the time they reach your stomach, the amylase in your saliva has broken the starch down into simple sugars. On the positive side, on the to-do side, rather than the don't side, is eating fermented foods. Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride, I don't know whether you've heard of her. She came up with this GAPS protocol, a GAPS diet for treating autism. She's very, very knowledgeable about gut health, and she insists that they are not optional. Fermented foods have been eaten by human beings from, if you go back about 70 years ago to the first fridges and freezers and so forth. Before then, there was no means of refrigeration, and there was fermentation. So some food, to preserve it, was fermented. So it's very important to try and design our lifestyle around consuming at least some fermented foods. Examples which you're welcome to try here later. This is a Japanese miso, which is a fermented rice and soy and wheat and things. And I stress that grains, they can be fermented. Once they're fermented, they very much change their nature. This is fermented vegetables, which I make at home. This is kefir, which is fermented raw milk. And in these bottles here is kombucha, and you're all most welcome to try any of these. We've got spoons and dishes and cups, so feel free to try those afterwards if you like. The last point, or not the last point actually, but the last point on this page, is to eat plenty of fibre, and that of course means you know, those vegetables and fruits. And by fruits, I don't mean bananas and oranges. I mean avocados, cucumbers, and things like that. Okay. So you may have heard of nutritional ketosis. This is something that is very, very much recommended that people put down on their list of things to look into if they're interested in health. It's absolutely essential. It's the process of adjusting your body to metabolize the breakdown products of dietary fats as opposed to sugar. And we're all familiar with the fact that the modern Western diet that we're largely exposed to almost everywhere, certainly in every restaurant, all over the place, is largely, you know, grains and sugars. They're all over the place, which means that our bodies are forever burning sugar as a primary fuel. So our mitochondria are running on the glycogen, and they're burning this black smoke of reactive oxygen species and free radicals inside the cell. That's where the damage occurs, and that needs to be mopped up by the immune system. So as soon as you switch into burning fat as your main source of dietary nutrient, if you like, you massively reduce the toxic load at a cellular level. So if we're going to look into that, if you're going to shift away from the grains and the processed food and the sugars, of course you need to eat more of something else, and the answer is to eat more healthy fats. And this is a big topic in itself. And unfortunately, it does. I mean, there's some great books on this. There's a fantastic book by Mary Enig called Know Your Fats. And that's just a great encyclopedia that tells you all about what to avoid and what not to. So healthy fats. Say again?
What's that called, sorry?
Know Your Fats by Mary Enig, E-N-I-G. Also very important to eat organic, because organic, by definition, has less glyphosate in it. It's not allowed, if your crop is being certified as organic, the farmers aren't allowed to spray the crops with glyphosate. But as we already noted, it's in the environment, it's in the wind, it's in the water. So your organic food will not be completely void of glyphosate, but it will have less in it. So it's essential. I think it's also a good idea because it sends a message to the market that you demand less toxic food. There are other things you can consider as well, not eating late in the evening, bringing your evening meal into the afternoon perhaps. Again, these may be challenging for our patterns of life and the way we work. But really the ultimate challenge here, when we're thinking about lifestyle choices, we're thinking about how to live. And I think, I propose that it's in our interest to really be prepared to redesign our lives from the ground up. We really need to make some fundamental changes, even if it's a long, slow process, and even if it takes a generation or so to do, and we can set our children up doing something different. It is very, very important. Intermittent fasting is something that you might want to consider as a lifestyle choice. It's quite easy, and it predisposes the body to finding it much easier to do a whole day fast or a 2 or 3 day fast, water fast, where you don't consume any food, just drink water. And intermittent fasting is a lead-in into this. It's quite easy to do because all you've got to do is skip breakfast or skip dinner. So what you're doing is you're simply compressing the window of time in which you eat. So there's no restriction on how much you eat, no restriction on anything to do with your eating habits, but simply by squishing the time window up to 8 hours, even maybe 6 hours, this has enormous benefit in predisposing your body to being able to burn fats, and it's something that can be used as a step in towards a longer fast, which is, as we mentioned earlier, highly recommended. So the last thing I want to say about diet, and I struggle with this one with my wife and children, and indeed, my mum and my wife's mum always turn up with treats for the children, and I it drives me potty because it seems insane to me when you have the knowledge of how harmful sugar is, when you consider it a nice, kind thing to give to a child, it really is upside down. I mean, it really is bordering on insanity when you look at it in light of all the facts. Obviously, people that hand their children treats are evading the facts and preferring not to examine them, really. So lifestyle choice number 3 is water and hydration. He says, reaching for a drink. It's really important in the context of today not to drink tap water. Tap water is not really fit for human consumption. It has antibiotics in it, prescribed ones that have gone through people's bodies and come out the other side. It's got birth control pills in and estrogen-mimicking compounds. It's got chlorine in it. It's got agricultural runoff in it. It's got glyphosate in it. It's got prescribed pharmaceutical drugs in it. It can have narcotics and things flushed down toilets in it. You name it, it's in tap water. It really is well worth avoiding. It's also worth noting that some bottled water, it's reckoned that some studies have shown that 40% of bottled water is tap water. So be careful with your bottled water. What are the options for alternatives? Well, well water and borehole water is probably not a realistic option for most people, but depending on where you are, that can be ideal. Bottled water really should be a good quality and preferably in a glass bottle, not in a plastic bottle, because of all the the BPA and these other endocrine disruptors that leach out of the plastic. Probably the best bet is either some sort of countertop water filter or better still, a whole house filtration system, because if you're showering under tap water or you're bathing in hot water, the toxins in the water become volatile, i.e. they become airborne, they turn into vapor and you end up inhaling them. So if you enjoy a hot shower under tap water every day, you're inhaling chlorine and all these other things. It's briefly worth considering front-loading your water intake, which is basically drinking more in the morning, making sure you're adequately hydrated. It's generally accepted by the medical fraternity that almost everyone is walking around in a state of dehydration. Most people are dehydrated at a cellular level. And it's important to note, of course, that just drinking gallons of water and then peeing all day isn't the same as being hydrated at the cellular level. So remembering to drink first thing when you get up, perhaps half a pint, maybe even a pint of water on rising is a good idea. You've obviously not been drinking all night, and it helps kickstart the hydration process. You may want to consider electrolytes. These are supplements that you can get to mix into drinks, and they provide various minerals and electrolyte charges that can assist in getting the water into the cell. Also, float tanks are worth mentioning. There's a float tank is where you have a float experience in Epsom salts. I don't know whether any of you have heard of this, but you're basically suspended weightlessness in an Epsom salt water tank, which it's a fantastic experience. But amongst other things, your skin absorbs a colossal amount of magnesium during a float. And again, most people are hugely deficient in magnesium. And so that can be a very, very beneficial thing, and the magnesium helps in cellular hydration. Kombucha, my favourite drink of choice. Feel free to try this later. This is raspberry flavour and this is apple flavour. It's a simple drink that you can make at home. It does require filtered or fairly pure water to be used in its manufacture, because it's basically microbes that are doing the fermentation process, and they'll be killed by any toxins in the water. So lifestyle choice number 4 is to do with getting out into the environment. It's a key way to inoculate our gut and our body with more microbes, to increase that diversity of our microbiome, is to literally get reconnected with the environment. And I'm sure some of us do already live outdoor lives to some extent, but in a worst-case scenario where you're going from a hermetically sealed home into an air-conditioned car, into an office, and then back again, and rarely sort of get out and about. A lot of people don't even have gardens worth visiting these days. Gardens are shrinking, so this is all stacked against us, and it is driving our lifestyles inside, which is to our bitter cost. So it's really important to make friends with the dirt. We mentioned germ theory earlier on, and we've kind of moved beyond that now, and we realise that these microbes are our friends, and we need to make sure that we don't act on that sort of inherited conditioning, if you like, of microbial sprays everywhere and insisting that everything's sanitised and sterilised. This is really quite counterproductive in the light of recent knowledge. So animals are also a huge source of microbes. Just stroking your cat or your dog or your hamster or your budgie or whatever you have in your home, or maybe even visiting horses that might be in a field up the road and stroking those, you're literally getting a microbial download, if you like, from the animal. So, if you fluffy up and woolly your dog, there'll be lots and lots of microbes, all, getting airborne. And if you breathe, you know, you'll be ingesting them, they'll hit the mucous membrane and they'll be inoculating your gut. And it's not something to find gross or to find repugnant. It's just a great way of diversifying your microbiome. Getting your hands in the soil, similarly, you know, dirty fingernails. I run an organic smallholding, so I'm afraid I do have dirty fingernails, even tonight. But getting our hands in the soil, even growing our own food, all very, very good ways of exposing ourselves to huge numbers of microbes. If you were to just bend down in your garden and pull a weed, something like a feverfew or something, pull that out of the ground, if you're relatively near to it, of course, bending down, there's an explosion of airborne microbes every time you do that, and you end up breathing them in. You're probably familiar with that lovely smell of fresh soil. That's all the microbes, you're breathing them in. Grounding as well, electrical contact with the earth, another very, very good means of support for the immune system, because the earth, as you probably know, is negatively charged. It has a virtually unlimited supply of free electrons. And if you simply walk barefoot on damp grass or walk in the beach on wet sand, you're immediately availing your body to an unlimited number of these free electrons, which are then instantly available to your immune system to lower your informational load and so forth. It's really worth looking into that. Sunbathing, getting out and obviously exposing ourselves to the sun to make vitamin D essential for mitochondrial health. Here in the latitudes of the UK, we probably only have enough sun. The sun's only high enough from May, June, July, probably. That's all we've got, about 3 months really of useful vitamin D manufacture. For that reason, it's a good idea to get out there in the sun when you can, even if it's only your face and hands. Anything's better than nothing. And also, it's worth, on that note, considering supplementing with vitamin D, vitamin D3 specifically, because vitamin D is an essential component for a healthy life and a healthy body. So there we are, outdoor living and exposing ourselves to microbes. Lifestyle choice number 5 revolves around sleep. We live in a 24/7 culture, as I mentioned earlier. So, you know, some people are doing shift work. I used to shift work when I was flying aeroplanes, and I used to sometimes have to stay up all night, and I found that very much a strain on my body. We've also got blue screens from TVs and computers and so forth. The blue light spectrum being particularly disruptive to the circadian rhythm. Also, it's worth noting that it is while we sleep that our bodies do this rejuvenation, this cellular repair. This is going on while we sleep, and most notably during the deep sleep part of our sleep cycle. We enter sleep, we enter into REM, and then light sleep, and then deep sleep, and we cycle in out of these 3 states through the night. And it's in the deep sleep, which largely occurs in the earlier part of the night. I often wear a device that monitors my sleep patterns, and I've noticed that almost all of my deep sleep occurs before midnight. It's sometimes a little bit after that. So also a cool and a completely dark bedroom is really important. And again, these are things that can be challenging. Sleeping in an electromagnetic-free zone. This is a huge one. We're going to come on to electromagnetic fields in a second, but some people might leave their mobile phone switched on beside them all night while they sleep, which is really not recommended at all. It's ideal to try and, you know, switch off any Wi-Fi, switch off your phones, and even to the extent that of electrically isolating your bedroom. Because we'll talk a little bit more about electromagnetic fields in a moment, but if you can sleep in a space that is free of electromagnetic fields, you're going to be much better able to rejuvenate and replenish and repair during the night than being in a state where even more cellular damage is being done by reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species that result in being exposed to electromagnetic fields. Another thing you can do is to sleep grounded. You can sleep on a grounding sheet, which is electrically plugged into the wall. Obviously, it doesn't use the live electricity, but it takes advantage of the earthing socket. So if your house is properly earthed, you simply plug your bed sheet into the wall, and the sheet contains strands of silver, and you lie on it, and you spend the night availing yourself to these free electrons, and it's a great way, again, to boost that rejuvenation and that rebuilding, which is what we're trying to do to ensure that we live a ripe old age with a functioning body. And then lastly, avoiding the blue lights before bedtime and so forth to help you to sleep. So lifestyle choice number 6, going to have to zip up here. We've got another 15 minutes, I think. Lifestyle choice number 6 is to avoid toxicity. This is one that we really have to bring to bear. We have to sort of be conscious of this all the time. It's the only way to do it, is to really embrace it and think, you know, if we're to achieve this longevity, this functioning body, we really, really must be very cautious about the toxins we expose ourselves to. So eating organic, we've already touched upon, and that can extend even into washing up without soap. You know, your fairy liquid, you end up ingesting it unless you're particularly careful about rinsing. It is entirely possible to wash up without any soap detergent at all, just with hot water. I'll leave you with that thought, though. Be careful with eating out. Eating out, of course, you're going to be eating cheap, poorly sourced ingredients. All the sauces are full of additives. It's really, you know, pizza and all these other takeaways really exemplify all of the worst things that we're trying to avoid if it's health and longevity we want. Fragrances, air fresheners, cosmetics, shampoos, toothpaste, soaps, you know, the whole lot. There are so many personal care products, and we need to become aware that if you look at your shampoo bottle and if there's 10 ingredients on there that you can't even pronounce, then you really shouldn't be availing those to entering your body. There's a rule of thumb that it's wise to adhere to, which is don't put anything on your skin unless you're prepared to put it in your mouth and eat it. Now that obviously sounds shocking in the context of our current culture, where we use an absolute plethora of toxic substances for all manner of things. But that is the golden rule. So when we think about cosmetic products, it is difficult to maintain our standard of personal care, if you will, and shift away from all these toxic chemicals. But it really does behove us to at least be conscious of that and try and at least begin the process. Using our consumer power is one way we can do that, of course. Even sunscreen and things, the skin is a sponge, and anything you put on the skin will be absorbed and will end up in your bloodstream. And that is absolutely crucial to know when we're dousing ourselves with toxic things. Even fragrances and toilet waters and perfumes, it must be noted, are simply a toxic concoction. So they might smell nice, it might be socially acceptable, it might be part of our culture to wear them, but in the same way that we need to question treating our children with sugar, we need to question the wisdom of spraying and applying toxic substances to our skin. Of course, this extends to household things, carpets, paints, furniture, all of this sort of stuff, even organic clothing and bed linen. In fact, probably bed linen is a good place to start, given that you spend 8 or 9 hours of your life there every night, breathing in right next to your pillow. And also it's worth mentioning that woolen pillows and duvets and things are far superior to any feathers. If you use duck or goose down or all these other popular things, they tend to harbour dust mites and all sorts of other microbes that can cause problems. Wool is wonderful. Get organic woolen stuff, and you won't have any problem with any mites or anything like that. So we need to be cognizant as well of the need to detoxify. I briefly mentioned Natasha Campbell-McBride's GAPS dietary protocol. That's something you could look into for detoxifying. Juicing is a good method to detoxify, as long as you're careful, of course, with what you put in your juice and not too much sugar. The other thing is colonic irrigation. This is the washing out of the colon, as you may be aware, and for loads of people who perhaps only have a bowel movement once every 3 or 4 days, or in some cases even once a week, then the colon is going to be caked with the wall of it is going to be encrusted and blocked, and this is where the liver delivers toxins into the colon to be dumped overboard into the stool to be ejected overboard. Now this can't happen, if your colon is in the poor state that unfortunately the average colon is. So this is something you might want to consider. I'll leave you to think about that. There are also all sorts of herbs and additives and supplements that can assist in detoxification. Chlorella, coriander and parsley are 2 herbs that are good to add into salads a lot, and you can use other things as well, like diatomaceous earth, and there's another one that escapes my mind at the moment. I'll maybe think of it in a minute. And also bathing in Epsom salts. I mentioned float tanks, even putting Himalayan crystal salt in your bath. It can be a good way of both detoxifying. It enables your body to shed things through the skin and absorb various minerals through the skin as well. Obviously, the Himalayan crystal salt is a magnificent source of 70 or 80, maybe even 90 or so different minerals that you won't find in table salt. So lifestyle choice number 7 is considering our use of electromagnetic field generating devices. Now this is an inescapable fact of modern life. Everyone's on their mobile phone all the time. It's difficult to find somewhere where there isn't a mobile phone mast. We have Wi-Fi in our homes, and it really behoves us to take on board that this is a huge threat to our health, even to our the continuance of the human race in the fact that it compromises fertility to the extent that it does. So electromagnetic fields consist of, the most obvious one is of course phones and Wi-Fi, where we have this pulsed microwave radiation, and we have these the means by which your smartphone, your Bluetooth, and the wireless baby monitors, all of these things use microwaves that are pulsed as part of the technology. But similarly as damaging can be simple electric fields and their associated magnetic fields. So simply from the wiring loom around your bedroom, if your bed is parked up against a wall and there's a wiring loom and you have wires coming out to electronic devices next to the bed, all of that is emitting electrical fields. This laptop now, I know because I've measured it, it's currently unearthed, and it will be emitting an electrical field approximately 1.5 meters in all direction around it, which of course you're sitting in if you're using your laptop. You can earth a laptop or any computer using a USB device, which makes that field collapse immediately down to about 3 or 4 inches. So things like that can be very, 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 very useful. And this also we need to extend this awareness into our whole usage, really, of all of these devices. One thing you want to consider is perhaps wiring your home for Ethernet cables. This is a great way, of course, ditching the Wi-Fi. At the very least, switch the Wi-Fi off at night. For many of us, of course, if you live in close proximity with other people, this can be very difficult because you're subject to their Wi-Fi as well. So with phones and things, we just have to get into keeping it in airplane mode more, texting more, calling less, using the phone on speaker mode at arm's length, or better still, put it in a selfie stick and hold it about 1 meter away from you, and that way you've escaped most of the worst danger from a smartphone. So, yes, ultimately, really, it's about questioning the lifestyle of, this constant connectivity and this constant use of phones. It's in our own interest to do that. I mean, obviously not telling anybody what to do and what not to do, but we have to be aware of the dangers so that we can make informed choices. So the last lifestyle choice I'm going to mention here is movement and exercise. We all know, of course, that exercise is a huge component of health. And what I have found is that the 3 major components that I'm trying to address in ensuring that I clock the 100 mark in 50 years' time is that I practice yoga. Now, yoga is a brilliant way of ensuring that our bodies retain the flexibility and the range of movement. I think I'm being hurried up to finish here. But essentially, we need to design a lifestyle that involves movement. And there's things called high-intensity interval training, which is a form of cardio that can be very, very time efficient. Instead of spending 4 hours in the gym over a week, you're talking about spending minutes. So, yeah, we need to look for an active outdoor lifestyle is really the takeaway point there. We need to design as much movement into our day as we can. And that needs to inform our choices of what jobs we do and what activities we do, perhaps what hobbies we uptake. So there are a few other considerations that are worth very, very briefly mentioning, and that is the use of antibiotics. Antibiotics is devastating to your microbiome and really should be reserved only for when absolutely necessary. And they can be life-saving, and they do have to be used on occasion, and that's when they should only be used. C-section deliveries and breastfeeding, obviously very important for the next generation, ensuring that they inherit a healthy and diverse microbiome and not the microbiome of the hospital, which is what the baby gets if it's C-section delivered. We need to manage stress, of course, and most importantly, I think, is to be conscious of our values, to constantly remind ourselves, what is it I want? Do I want health, or do I want the various conveniences of modern living? There's a very good gut supplement called Restore, which is also something worth considering because it's a very good way of ensuring that you don't suffer from leaky gut. So very, very briefly, again, last point. What happens when it all breaks down? Oh, I can't maintain that diet. I can't keep this up. And this is absolutely par for the course. It happens for everybody. And what I found in my own personal experience, as I've struggled with addictions and all sorts of problems, is that just to keep getting back on and to keep getting back on and to keep getting back on and to keep trying it, and like riding a bike, you just get better. You get better at pursuing the values, the things you value. And if we combine that with consciously reminding ourselves, I want to live to 90, I want to be able to run around with my great-grandchildren, or however you want to picture that. But we need to just be conscious of our long-term goals. Convenience versus health and taste versus health really sums it up. And emotional freedom technique or tapping is something that you can use to help you when you struggle with changing habits. I've used that to great effect. And indeed, affirmations. So there we go. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope that this perspective is helpful in some way and maybe gives you some food for thought to take away and maybe even share some of these ideas because, if we do want to live a long time in a healthy, functioning body, then, these are some of the things that we need to try and design into our lives. Thank you very much for listening. Anyway, I'm happy to take some questions, although I fear we might not have much time for questions.
I think we have. It's just
Jolly good.